Welcome, everybody, to the Always So podcast, a production of Willwood's Faith and Marriage. This is Dr. Mario Sacasa, and I just want to start this episode by saying thank you. Thank you so much for giving me your time. This is the first time you listen to this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. If you have been a longtime listener, then thank you so much for the many hours that you have shared with me through this amazing medium called podcasting. Well, in today's episode, I welcome back Kristen Theriault to the show. Last year, we had a wonderful conversation about a book called The Psychology and the Cross that I'll have a link to. It's a phenomenal conversation if you're interested about knowing how faith and science can intersect and how Catholic spirituality and an understanding of the human person through psychology can be integrated. It's a wonderful, wonderful text that I can't speak enough positive things about. And so I was grateful for Kristen joining me on the show last year to have that conversation. I welcome Kristen back to talk about two books being issued by Sophia Institute Press, The World is Too Small, The Life and Times of Mother Cabrini, and The Mother Cabrini Companion, A Spiritual Journey with a Courageous Woman of God. Both of these books have been published to coincide with the release of the Cabrini movie by Angel Studios. And so we talk all about Mother Cabrini in today's episode. We talk about the movie, what the movie got right, where it took some creative licenses, some of the critiques that have been offered against the movie. We speak against them. We offer critiques to those critiques. But then we spend a lot of time just getting to know who Mother Cabrini is and why is she just such a pivotal person for us in our day and age, and why she is a tremendous saint that we need to be paying attention to. And so we cover her early life, her vocational discernment, how she started her missions in New York, and in the 60 plus other missions that followed. And so today you will learn more about Mother Cabrini than you probably ever have before. And so I'm grateful to be able to offer this episode to increase devotion to her, a great saint, and to just to continue the good work that Angel Studios has done by drawing attention to her story. And I just hope that you enjoy the show. So let's get into this conversation with Kristen Theriault. Kristen Theriault, welcome back to the Always So podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
Well, you've had some changes in your life because last time I had you had a different last name, and otherwise you entered a witness protection program, or maybe you got married. So we'll assume the latter.
Yes, probably a safe assumption. I got married in September and I traded one hard to pronounce name for yet another one, but at least this one you had met people with this last name before, right? So it might be easier for people.
This is true. My Louisiana history here, introduced me to Theriaults, although the Theriaults in Louisiana spell a little bit differently than yours. And so
I'll have to find these long lost cousins someday and figure out who's right.
Couldn't have fallen in love with a Smith or somebody with a
I know. No, can't be boring like that.
Oh, well, it's wonderful. Well, I appreciate you coming back on the show. As I shared with you before we got started, the conversation, I think was it last year that I had you on, or the year before? I lose track of time. Whenever the Psychology and the Cross.
Summer, but
last summer when the book Psychology and the Cross, it really is. Mm-hmm. It's all a blur. When that book came out, I was just deeply struck by it, and have passed it on to a number of folks. And just grateful. It was one of my favorite conversations of last year was being able to talk to you about that. So thanks for giving me that opportunity and now coming back. So today we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to talk about Mother Cabrini and the book that you wrote, which is The Mother Cabrini Companion, A Spiritual Journey with a Courageous Woman of God, which I guess you didn't write it. I know you edited a number of you compiled a number of her quotes and organized them, but still you're the principal author, I guess, in that. And then also you're the spokesperson for The World is Too Small, The Life and Times of Mother Cabrini, written by Theodore Maynard,
as far as I understand.
Maynard.
Yeah.
Okay, great. See, I'm terrible with last names. They've already identified myself as somebody who can't pronounce people's last names correctly. So, Theodore Maynard. Okay, so you're speaking about these books. You're in this groove of talking about Mother Cabrini. All right, this is where I want to start. In your companion, you wrote in the introduction, what emerges from Mother Cabrini's words is a portrait of a soul completely at peace, but never at rest. What does that mean?
I love that you chose that quote first, because this is some that in other interviews has been picked as well, and I've been using this quote so much. I'm pretty proud of that line, actually.
You
But
should be.
really, what I was trying to get at with this is that we think of busyness today as a distraction, and oftentimes it can be, as we're scrolling social media or trying to fill our lives with things just for the purpose of filling them, but not really in service of a greater vocation, as was the case with Mother Cabrini, or a greater purpose. Mother Cabrini was someone who possessed this beatific calm and peace that was rooted in her trust and love of God. And so she was never lacking in peace. She always understood that whatever happened to her, including the adversities, were part of God's plan, and she took those really quite in stride. However, she was never at rest. And what this means is that she was always quite busy. She was always working. She lived 67 years, which was remarkable considering her illness. She had tuberculosis as a child, which followed her throughout her life. But in this lifespan, she accomplished so much, including about the same number of missions. She founded missions in the 60s and across many continents. And so this required a lot, obviously, of work, tenacity, and to a certain degree, busyness. The difference is that Mother Cabrini's busyness was always in service of her vocation, and it was for a greater purpose. And it was also never for self-aggrandizement. She never took the credit for these accomplishments as something that reflected well on herself, but rather gave that glory back to God. So she simultaneously possessed really this dual vocation, because she was a religious sister, and she had quite the contemplative and meditative life, as many of her writings will illustrate, but she also was very active in the world. And this was actually kind of a difference that sets Mother Cabrini apart from previous generations of nuns and sisters, religious women, was that her order was the first all-female missionary order to operate at this scale. So this was something quite unprecedented in the church's history, and part of why, as we see in the film, making this case before the Pope was somewhat unheard of. And so she had to both keep her inner soul at this level of spiritual advancement, and she is someone who considered vocation and conversion to never be complete. So she never would think that, yes, I can sit back on my laurels and rest now. She always was seeking to a deeper conversion of heart. But also, on the other hand, she used what she gained from her meditative life to bring into her active service, and then also vice versa. She would take the lessons she learned from service and from her mission into her deeper relationship with God. So she had to maintain that inner peace in order to face the adversities on the outside, but she also, as we can see from just her heart for charitable zeal and for serving the marginalized, she needed to do that in the world in order to draw close to God. So these two sides of her vocation, while they seem at first like they might be things that might be at odds, they were actually quite complementary.
Yeah. Well, praise the Lord. I mean, you've seen it in, have you read The Soul of the Apostolate? You ever read that book?
I have not.
Yeah.
No.
And so that book speaks beautifully about this kind of complementarity, this notion that the active life flows from the contemplative life. And that in our modern world, as you already indicated, we're so active, we're so busy, we're so focused on doing. And some of that is, of course, an age of secularism that can really only find human value in utility and in what we do and what we perform, because there's no inherent value that's there. So at some level, we have to, even as Catholics and Christians, have to be mindful that we're kind of swimming in these waters, this notion that, like, hey, we're more than what we produce, okay? But still, God's calling us to have a certain active life as well. And so what is the right balance in that? Well, then that's where the contemplative life comes from. And in the book, that uses this illustration from St. Bernard of Clairvaux, that St. Bernard says that we shouldn't so much be channels of God's peace, but rather reservoirs. Channels, just the water flows through it, and that's it, and leaves nothing for itself. But a reservoir, what it does in terms of it fills itself up, and then after it's filled, it overflows that water into the surrounding fields. And there's a very different image of being able to say, well, if we can fill ourselves up with God's grace, and that is primarily through our prayer life, through the sacraments, through participation in the life of the church, through an honest recognition that God is at work within us, seeing God's providence honestly operating in our midst, but then also having that sense of zeal and courage to go get stuff done. whatever desires you feel that God's put on your heart, like go and do them also. And so then there's this balance that's here, that I'm not doing, as you indicated, just to for self-aggrandizement. I'm not doing just to be successful for its own sake, but I'm doing it because I'm doing it because I'm of a greater purpose within me. Now, I will say, even that is tricky, even for those of us who are kind of in more public-facing ministries, or where it's like, well, where's the line between where's my ego and then what am I actually doing for the Lord? And I think even in the movie, it's one of my favorite lines in the movie is when the Archbishop, is just frustrated with Mother Cabrini, and it finally says to her, he's like, Mother, I don't know where your ambition begins and your faith ends.
Right.
So it's kind of like, that's my favorite line. I was like, what a compliment. I mean, that's incredible.
I know.
So what could we speak more to that? What can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I love that reservoir analogy, because I think in our modern parlance, we'll often say you can't pour from an empty cup, just in a more secular sense. And that is definitely drawing from the same theme. And Mother Cabrini wrote a lot about this because one of the two sources that I relied on heavily for the companion were her letters home to her sisters from her travels abroad. So something that reflects her activity and the active portion of her life. And then on the other hand, her retreat notes. And these were not from retreats that she led, but rather those that she attended as a penitent and as a time for her to enter quiet contemplation. And of course, one of her favorite saints was Saint Frances Xavier, whose middle name she took as her religious name, and he himself was a great missionary. But she quotes him, and I include this, I'll paraphrase it, but she says that he would admonish his followers that if they went to the missions not well grounded in faith, they could easily lose their faith. Whereas if they went to the missions with a solid foundation of faith and with a prayer life built up, they were more likely to win conversions that way. So tending to the interior garden, so to speak, is something that was not secondary to her love of souls, but was required for reaching them. And so she has many, she also almost writes with somewhat of a desperation about the number of souls who could be lost. And it's really beautiful to think of her love for every single soul. So for example, I'll quote from page 60, she says, "The days fly, souls are being lost. Death is approaching more quickly than we realize, and then the time for work is over." So she has this urgency for her time on earth to take as many with her to heaven as is possible through God's grace. But then again, right on the next page, she's posing the question that basically how will we lead this number of souls to heaven? And she says, the first condition is prayer. And she continues to give examples of St. Frances Xavier, St. Teresa, for example, and others where this is the first step in order to actually be a successful missionary. And then, of course, in the missionaries, in the missions themselves, the physical portion of the mission, the orphanages, the schools, and the hospitals, which are kind of the trifecta of each of these sites, that was really secondary. This humanitarian effort and this relief of physical suffering was really in service of reaching the soul and of the eternal good of the souls that she wished to save. So she ultimately had their eternity and their immortal soul in mind, and their salvation would be something that long after she and her sisters had gone, the soul would maintain and retain the foundation of faith, the prayer life, the lessons that had been imbued to them by the sisters, as well as obviously benefiting from the more humanitarian aspects of her work.
How did you get access to those resources?
So her letters are actually free, public domain on archive.org. So if anyone would be interested, I would highly encourage reading the whole things. Here, I've kind of tried to extract some of the more introspective gems, and I've organized them by theme, 52 weeks worth, so 52 themes, some more similar than others. But reading them in full is really quite fun, because she'll punctuate these extremely poetic thoughts about God's creation and the interior life with somewhat more mundane things like what they had for breakfast that morning or things like that. And so for someone who has a historical interest in this age of travel, because of course she's traveling on these ocean liners in the pre-Titanic era, the whole picture was very interesting to me, and the chronology of it too. So basically they pick up where the movie leaves off. So after New York, she went on to found all of these other missions. New York was sort of the prototype, and eventually her mission after her death did make it to China as well, which was her original really just desire in life was to be a missionary to China. So these, I think, paint a very interesting picture of her whole life, because it seems like her life's work could have been just focused in New York, and then you realize that she went on and did that in 60 other places, and it's just
incredible.
The scope of it
It's
becomes incredible.
The scope of it's absolutely incredible. I mean, when you talk about 60 different countries, 60 different places, and the fact that this is the turn of the 20th century, and there aren't airplanes. She ain't flying around everywhere. I mean, it took her from like a month to get from Nicaragua to New Orleans.
Right.
And the fact that she like did all this back then, which by today's standards would be absolutely incredible. But then it needs to be said that she did it all as a woman, you know, in a time when it just wasn't viewed as I don't know, polite, capable, you know, for women to do what she was capable of doing, 100 years ago. It's just inspiring, absolutely inspiring.
Definitely. And that, I think, that comes through very much in the movie, right?
Yeah, it does.
The discrimination she faced,
right,
because not only of her religion, her ethnicity, and her gender, but interestingly, in many of these letters, you can see that the power of her motherhood and the power really of true feminism, which is, of course, imitating the feminine genius that John Paul II isolated and imitating Our Lady, was really part of her secret, so to speak, of getting things done. So I was fascinated to learn that on these ocean liners, she was treated with a lot of deference from both the captain and from some of the first class passengers. And she actually gained conversions on the ships among the higher echelons of society, who we often don't think of as needing conversion. But she was traveling with many Protestant passengers and would always try to plant the seeds of faith with them as well. And so it was really interesting that the fact that she was a woman traveling alone or with her sisters, which was somewhat unheard of in those days, actually garnered this interest in her and this protective attitude of others towards her that allowed her that to get into the conversation and to try to convert them as well, because that was always at the forefront of her mind.
That's incredible. This is a little bit of an aside, but I read somewhere that she was actually scheduled to be on the Titanic. Was that true?
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Oh.
That is fascinating.
What I read is that she was in I believe if the story's correct, somebody can fact check me on this, but I think what I read was that she was in Italy in one of her trips, meeting in Italy, and she was going to go to England to meet with her sisters there, and then from England head back to New York. And her sisters in England had already purchased a ticket on this new, liner called the Titanic, and they were going to surprise her and they were, give her excitement to go on this new liner. So, but from Italy, she got word that something was going wrong in New York, and so she needed to get to New York quicker than what she had anticipated, and so she bypassed her trip to England and went straight from Italy to New York, therefore not going on the Titanic.
That's almost unbelievable. God's providence. But also I love the stories of the Catholic priests on the Titanic who went down listening to hearing confessions from people. So yeah. I'm sure she would have known how to act in that situation.
I think the exact same thing. I mean, I think what I read her say was something that, exactly, it was God's providence, that obviously she was able to continue her mission. But I too agree, similar, like she just seems to have this capacity to just, this isn't even good to say justice, but to make the best of what's around, really being able to take whatever circumstances there. So if she would have gone down in the Titanic, then she would have converted souls, but God had different plans for her. And so here we are talking.
Right.
So, okay, we're into this conversation, and I think we have failed to define our terms. So for anybody who doesn't know who Mother Cabrini is, Kristen, who is Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini, and why should we be paying attention to her?
Sure. So a quick background of her life. She was born in 1850 in the Lombard region of Italy. She had a religious vocation from quite a young age. She attended a school with the Sisters of the Sacred Heart, but unfortunately, due to her health, again, she had tuberculosis when she was very young. She was denied entry into two of her convents of choice. We can see in retrospect that this was God's providence in action, because she did go on to found her own order, which became the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, first of its kind, first all-female order, as we mentioned, to take mission work at the global scale. And she started small. So she started locally in Italy with orphanages and doing charitable work on a smaller scale, and was approaching both the Archbishop of her particular diocese and then eventually the Pope, as depicted in the movie, to make the case for a global mission. And this is something that took a lot of trying to get actually off the ground. And like we mentioned, she wanted to go to the East. And as the Pope says, which is quoted in the movie, not to the East, but to the West. And he showed her the immense poverty, especially and predominantly among the Italian immigrants, that was going on in New York City at the time, and how her particular love of souls and also her background from Italy would be the perfect match for ministering to these people and serving them. From then, she went on to found, as we said, about 65 other missions throughout the globe. In the U.S., of course, as you know, with your background from Louisiana, she went down there. She actually attended, as far as I understand, there was one of the largest lynchings in American history happened in Louisiana, and it was of Italian men who were accused of a murder, and she didn't believe they were being given a fair trial. So this is what precipitated her travel to Louisiana, and then once there, she discovered the needs of the people and ended up founding a mission. She went on to Chicago. Of course, there's a shrine there for her to this day. Her mission also took her to the western part of the United States. Colorado is one that she writes about a lot in her travel letters, which is a very interesting situation because she needed to adapt the way she approached the missions depending, obviously, on the locale, which seems obvious. But Colorado was somewhat of an outpost at that time.
Yeah.
It was just a town of workers who were very transient. And the Catholic workers especially did not have a solid Catholic presence. The priest would travel maybe once a month. They didn't have a community, so to speak. And so she was finding that their faith, of course, was suffering from this and that morality had started to degrade. And so this was really her purpose there, was to bring these people who are a bit asleep in their faith back to an active practice of the faith on a regular basis. And this is actually somewhat similar to what she experienced in New York, as Theodore Maynard illustrates in his biography. This was kind of new to me, but there were a few problems spiritually in New York. So obviously the poverty does not help. So when Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs is not met, it becomes very difficult to sustain a spiritual life at the level that is needed. But in addition to that, he also talks about the Italian immigrants bringing over certain anti-clericalist attitudes from Italy. So at this time, the socialist movements and the more leftist movements that were anti-church were happening in Italy. And we see this in the film with the opera star character who has no problem helping a fellow Italian, but he has a problem helping the church and has become alienated from the church in that way. And so this kind of what was just imbued in the culture and took a lot of good faith efforts on the part of the clergy to bring them back into a proper understanding of Catholic clergy. And so it was just very interesting to me that poverty not only can cause physical suffering, but can cause this both moral and spiritual suffering as well. And we see this obviously in 5 Points, the children had to live not only in extremely horrific physical conditions, but also there is the prostitution ring that's going on, and they're falling into that and being just completely decimated by this vicious cycle that occurs in places where poverty is rampant. And so she has a beautiful story arc in the movie of including the reformed prostitute character Vittoria, who is able to basically be saved from that life and to have her spirit, her soul restored, and how there is this really symbiotic relationship between the physical suffering and alleviation of that, and then the spiritual health of the people.
So she was a powerhouse, is what you're saying.
Yes. I got a bit off track there, but to wrap up her life, she lived to the age of 67. She died, I believe, in Chicago. And there's a beautiful story of the week of her death was the week before Christmas, and she actually died while making care packages for local children. So right up until the very end, she died doing what she loved and what she was called to do. Her body is at the shrine in New York City, which is right about the same area as the Met Cloisters, which I hope to travel to at some point soon. And then her head is actually preserved in Rome. Okay. And she was canonized in 1946. So she died in 1917. And then a few decades later, she was already canonized, which is remarkably quick for the church. I mean, some saints, they're centuries later, are finally canonized. So she obviously had quite a following among Americans. She's patron saint of immigrants, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And even in discussing her with some of the older generations, both of my grandparents, for example, said their families had a strong devotion to Mother Cabrini.
Really?
And I did not know this before, but I think she was just so hard to miss in all of the waves that she was making. And she is a very contemporary saint, that her devotion was very strong until the last several decades, and hopefully will, after this movie, grow to that level again.
I didn't know anything about her until we moved to New Orleans, and there's a Cabrini High School in New Orleans, and they have her office kind of still intact that she had established. She was working at in New Orleans, and I think they even have one of her habits. And so I knew that she was short in stature because you can see that the habit is rather diminutive,
right?
Of a woman, in anybody. And so that was the first time I really think I heard of her. Maybe throughout the years I heard that she was the first American saint, or U.S. citizen saint. I believe the first American-born saint would be Elizabeth Ann Seton.
That's right. Yep.
This isn't a Catholic trivia quiz for anybody, okay? So we just want to make sure I'm getting it right. But that was our first introduction to her. And so when the movie came out, I was interested. I was like, oh, this is great. And I was interested because one, I love what Angel Studios is doing. I love their movies and their programs. But I have to confess, I had to stop watching The Chosen after season 2, because every time I went to pray the Bible, I would see Jonathan Rumi as Jesus in my imagination. Oh, no. and so no disrespect to Jonathan Rumi. He's a handsome guy. I understand. And he's great. He's doing a wonderful job as Jesus. But I just didn't want to see his face every time I read the Gospels.
Right. I sympathize. I have a very powerful imagination. So if I see the movie before I read the book for anything, it will be stuck in my mind.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so I'm very similar. And because of that, I've actually been very strict with the boys about certain books. So the Harry Potter books, for example, they're not allowed to watch the movies until they've read all the books. And,
that's interesting. We had a similar policy growing up for the Tolkien books.
Similar with Tolkien. It's the same thing. I've told the boys, I said, you can't watch the movies until you've read the books. And so we've done that with each of those, with the Harry Potter, with Tolkien, and then with the C.S. Lewis also.
Wow.
Although they haven't made as many, of the Chronicles of Narnia books, but particularly Harry Potter and Tolkien. And in each of the boys it's been wonderful because they've preserved their own imagination of what the story is. And then when they watch the movies, it's like, oh, this doesn't really kind of match. I'm like, that's exactly what I would rather you have than the opposite. So you get it. I'm glad you don't think I'm nuts. Totally get it. So that's one. And then The Sound of Freedom, I wanted to support the movie, but sincerely, just being a therapist, it's just too much. I couldn't. Yeah. I'm grateful that they spotlighted the story. They brought attention to an evil that needs attention brought to it, and I hope that it's been successful in curbing some of these practices. But me personally, I just couldn't. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't.
Yeah.
I couldn't sign
I
up.
agree. I couldn't bring myself to watch that one either. Well, of course, I am very happy that, again, they're shedding light on it. But this, I think, was my first Angel Studios movie that I actually watched.
This was too. And so that's why I was happy to watch it. And, and it's intense for people who don't know. It's very dramatic. It's very beautiful. The movie's very, very, very well done. And a part of me, I think, is left wondering, like, when will Angel Studios come up with a comedy? Like, will they come up with something that's just a little bit lighter flair? All right, everybody, let's take a quick break here from my conversation with Kristen Theriault. Just want to encourage you to catch up on previous episodes of the Always Hope podcast, whatever platform that you're using, whether it's podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or just even through our web player at faithandmarriage.org. You're going to see the full list of episodes that are there waiting for you. And one episode that I really just want to draw attention to right now is an early episode I did in the show way back in 2019. I interviewed John Dijak about Walter Chiswick, and it was episode 35, November 12th, 2019 is when that show dropped. And I know that Father Walter Chiswick has garnered a lot of attention here recently thanks to the Lenten series that Hallow did that focused on his book, He Leadeth Me. And if you want to learn more about Father Walter Ciszek and this great saint of the 20th century, then you're going to want to listen to that episode. John D. Jack is a biographer of Father Walter, and it has an incredible devotion to him as well, and shares beautifully some stories from his own life and his devotion that he has to Father Walter. I myself have long had a devotion to Father Walter Ciszek and have been deeply impressed by his life, by his commitment to his faith, by his ability to just recognize divine providence operating within his midst, and just his capacity to be faithful with all the experiences that he encountered in northern Siberia. And so if you want to learn more about Father Walter, let's say you've wrapped up your prayer series, the Lenten series with Hallow, and you've just been interested in learning more about him, then I'll have a link to that episode also. And so check that out, episode 35, Who is Walter Ciszek of the Always Hope podcast. And you can catch up on other episodes in whatever platform you choose to listen to this show on. So let's get back to this conversation with Kristen Theriault. But the movie was excellent. So do you know why they picked this story up and why they decided to make this? Because it's not a Catholic production company.
Right.
And so what inspired them to want to pick this up? And then how did they reach out to Sophia to kind of publish these books and get the companion text to go with it?
It's a good question. I can't speak to Angel Studios' original motivation for the film, although I know it's been in the works for a few years now. I think maybe 5 years the idea germinated. So someone definitely had this in the forefront of their mind as a potential project. And of course, they were able to bring it to the screen at a time where a lot of these issues are being considered at the national level. So immigration, poverty, etc.
Yep.
Discrimination, as far as Sophia's project, Angel Studios approached us this year, and I actually turned this book around in about a month or so.
Oh my gosh.
This is somewhat of a short timeline, but this is meant to be a companion both to the movie, but also for the year. So as I mentioned, it's 52 weeks worth of devotions. So not something you have to read in one sitting, but you can take throughout the year, bring it to adoration each week, or take it to read after Mass, and then there's some journaling space at the end of each week too. So this was really, it was not something that was on my radar as a writer. I've published my first book actually in November, which is called When the Sickle Swings, Stories of Catholics Who Survived Communist Oppression, where that was based on years of work interviewing Catholics who had grown up under communist countries and then either emigrated to the US or stayed in their country and kept the faith, which was just an incredible culmination of something I've been interested in and fascinated by for a while. And so then I wasn't sure what my next writing project was going to be, and this was sort of just delivered to me as an opportunity. And so, like you, I had not known much about Mother Cabrini growing up, and I would sometimes get her confused with Elizabeth Ann Seton because of their similarities and their vocations. And after this, of course, I know a lot more and I'm much more devoted to her than before. But this was a bit of a surprise, and I pivoted and was really grateful to be able to work with the primary sources, because that's what I love doing with the background in history, is getting back to the source material itself. And I love reading saints, especially in their own writings. Like any historical figure I'm interested in, I love reading their own work, but saints especially, because they clearly have just this immense amount of grace from God. And to see the world through her eyes, especially when she's traveling and she'll make something even like a storm or a calm sea into a spiritual meditation, is just amazing. And you don't look at the world that way anymore, but trying to after reading this. So that's how it came about, really. Very providential, and I am guessing that whatever my next writing project will be will probably be just as much of a surprise, if not more than this one.
As the Lord often does. You didn't answer this earlier, but maybe I interrupted you, but the second piece, you said two primary sources, the letters that she wrote to her sisters, that's on archives.org, and then the other ones, her private writings on her retreats. How'd you get access to those? Is that also?
Those I had to get through interlibrary loan, actually.
Got it.
So,
okay.
Yep, those are a bit less accessible, but I know for anyone interested in reading her writings directly, Cabrini University does have a pretty good
Okay.
digital archive. So they have one of her writings called Memory, but it's only in Italian in the script. So it's just a scan of her written diary. And I just didn't have the time to translate that because I don't speak Italian yet. And so with the quick turnaround, that wasn't really in the cards, but something I'm hoping to delve into in the future.
Yeah, well, that sounds fantastic. All right, so going back to Mother Cabrini here, the title of the book, the biography, is the world is too small. Why is that a saying of hers? Why what was she meaning by that?
By this, she meant, as she says in the movie, that the world is too small for what she intended to do.
Mm-hmm.
And she says this to the Pope he has this shocked face at the end. And I think he says something similar to, where does your ambition end and your faith begin? But we can see that Mother Cabrini really relied solely on faith.
It was the Pope who said it. See, I got it confused. I said earlier it was the Archbishop.
Yeah, I remember that.
I got it wrong. My bad. See, I messed it up already.
They all have the same attitude.
They do. Kind of a disbelief and not sure what they're supposed to do with their,
right,
type of attitude.
Exactly. So we can say that on the surface, that does seem like an ambitious statement, that she has these grand global plans, especially in the age before real globalization had taken off. And
right.
How is this actually going to be implemented? But we ultimately, after reading her, understand that it was a calling from God, and that if he wanted this done, then it would get done. And Mother Cabrini didn't gain anything from this. Of course, traveling must have been enjoyable for her, but she also got very seasick, as I found reading this. So it was a sacrifice to her to be able to take the great lengths that she did in service of her vocation. And so the world really got a lot smaller within her lifetime, both in terms of historical and technological development, but also because of her own perception of it. And she, for example, this beautiful vignette comes to mind where she and her sisters are somewhere in Central America, and they've departed the main steamer, and they're on smaller boats. And as they row down the river, a huge flock of birds comes to follow them and alights on the boats and just is flying next to them. And they're speculating between themselves, what does this represent? Are these the number of souls that we're going to save at this mission? Or how about the number of souls in this mission in the future? Or maybe in all the missions? And they ultimately settled on probably this mission because, of course, they had so many other souls to save throughout the rest of the world. So another line that I use in the introduction is she refers to the house of the Cristoforo. So I'll read this right from the beginning of the book. If the Sacred Heart would give me the means, I would construct a boat called the House of Cristoforo, which means bearer of Christ, to traverse with one community, little or big, so as to carry the name of Christ to all people, to those who as yet do not know him, and also to those who have forgotten him. And that encapsulates her entire mission and reason for being alive right there. And again, as we talked about the differences between the missions, where sometimes it was reminding Catholics of the beauty of their faith and the necessity of practice, and other times it was bringing the faith to those who had not encountered it ever before. She saw all souls through the eyes of God, and ultimately, as we pray for Jesus to have mercy on all those, especially those who need it most, in the Fatima prayer, and then the Divine Mercy prayer, similar with can't remember it at the moment, but to bring all souls to heaven, especially those in need of thy mercy. This is the goal of all saints, is to bring the entire world, which of course Jesus died for all of us and each of us, to God, and that was his stated goal and his ambition, and so why shouldn't it be ours?
Yeah. And I mean, that's the Great Commission. I mean, that Christ gives to us, at the end of the gospel. That we're to go preach to the world, and baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We're supposed to go out to all ends of the world and to do this. And the church has her missionary activity has always been at the forefront of meeting people's needs. And that's always what's been beautiful, is the sense that what are the needs of this community, and how do we as a church, as a congregation, how are we going to meet this? How are we going to meet the needs that are here? And I've heard this in the sense of salvation is kind of making up for that which is lacking. So if there's like a hole, like making up for that which is lacking, And that's what we're talking about in terms of physically saying, like, we're making up for the things that are needed in this community, whether that's the orphanages, the schools, the hospitals, obviously the church's history, universities. I mean, all the things that Catholics have started throughout the history of the world are incredible. And all done from this sense of, well, maybe not all, but should be done, or primarily operating out of this place of, this is to bring glory to God. We take care of people to help them with their physical needs, with their material needs, but that they may also encounter Jesus through our mercy, Jesus through our service. And this is why we still do missionary work, to this day. But I don't know, at some point it seems like, and maybe this is me more speculating kind of in a more modern age, I feel like sometimes it's become like, I don't know, it's like, for lack of a better way of saying this, it feels like doing service work feels more liberal, and then, preservation of the faith kind of comes across as being more conservative. And what we see in her, and when the church is operating at its best, that those dichotomies just don't exist, that it's one and the same, that that it is service of people and to bring them closer to the faith. Like, it's not, they're not meant to be these kind of poles that have kind of, unfortunately happened, in our kind of modern kind of context.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great distinction. And you're right. These are artificial divisions. And to Mother Cabrini, I think this would be very foreign, this way of thinking. And unfortunately, it's a product of the past century and the divisions and sort of co-opting by various ideologies of Catholic truth. But she says here on page 72 that, well, to preface this, actually, she has a lot to say about the missionary vocation, of course. And so I split it into various themes that highlight aspects of the missionary vocation. And one of them was, interestingly, the missionary as the consoler of the divine heart. So not only does missionary work bring, of course, service and relief to those who she is serving, but this is also something that consoles Jesus. And so she says, "You, the chosen portions of Christ's flock, are destined to console his divine heart. You who by your work, prayers, and obedience can procure the glory of that heart, have become by your precious vocation the chosen portion of my heart." So, of course, speaking her love to her sisters as well. But this is an important unifying feature that we forget, is that there is no distinction between love God and love your neighbor as yourself. These are two parts of the same coin, that when we add distinctions, we're not actually operating in charity in full. And so she saw them as one and the same. And this is why, again, she considered prayer and interior life to be just as important as active missionary work, and vice versa. And so I think she, again, be aghast at these divisions that we have introduced. But it's a good reminder for us to, if we're lacking in one of those areas maybe and a bit more active in the other, to try to supplement that and to balance them.
Yes. Amen. Amen. Well, that quote that you just read, it kind of makes me think of Mother Teresa and putting "I thirst" in all her chapels for similar reasons, that this is us bringing Jesus, comforting Jesus, consoling him. I guess.
And I learned actually that Mother Teresa was personally inspired by Mother Cabrini and kept a picture of her on her desk, which is amazing, because you learn that all of your favorite saints have their own favorite saints, and we can definitely see the parallels in their work.
How much of the movie was accurate in its portrayal?
Let's see. I would say it was pretty accurate. I really liked the movie. I know there's been some controversy, and
well, I want to talk about that in a second, actually, because
yeah.
I want to critique the critiques if we can.
Yes.
So.
But first of all, I would say it was very accurate and on point from a historical perspective and a period drama. So the costumes were excellent. The settings were very good. And this is, of course, one of the concerns with either a Christian filmmaker or something with a lower budget is, is it going to look fake, or is that going to be a problem? And it definitely wasn't. So I think that will help to draw in a lot of film goers who may have otherwise not gone to see a movie about a Catholic saint, is that this high production quality is really excellent and really up there, and really helped to tell the story because you weren't distracted by things seeming off. Another thing is that I think the visual component to this story was very important, because it is very difficult to understand the level of poverty that these immigrants were experiencing without that visual component. So I think that was definitely the right medium to tell this story. even reading about it in her own biography and in other sources, it doesn't hit home the way that this visual portrayal was able to. So at least for me, I was completely struck by that. And then you read articles from the Times, so that like the New York Times piece that is featured in the movie, and how even that could only get so much of the story. Rats have it better. That was a good image to use, but even that was not nearly as bad as what the reporter himself actually experienced when he went with Mother into these areas. So that part I think was very good. In terms of her life, of course, there's only so much that can be included. So they took some fictional liberties with, I think, like the opera singer, I think he was a made-up character.
Sure.
And Vittoria, I think, was a character that could have existed but wasn't based on an exact person. But I think they are all those characters helped to communicate a truth about Mother Cabrini's life that is all right and is within the bounds of fictional representation to communicate. And this again focuses on only this short period of her life establishing the New York City mission. So these adversities that she faced, I think, were also accurate, it seems, where I think the Theodore Maynard discusses that when she arrived, the bishop wasn't expecting her. And
that's awesome.
He did not have somewhere for her to stay, or it was somewhere different than where she thought it was going to be, and had to recalculate right from the very beginning. And that was only the beginning of a long series of issues that would arise just logistically that she had to overcome. And then the criticism that I've heard that I can sympathize with a bit is that the movie didn't exactly portray her spiritual life in the deepest way.
Sure.
And I think for someone who may not be familiar with Mother Cabrini, that might not have that knowledge of her baked in, that sure, you could watch this and say, oh, she was just a very energetic woman and who knows what motivated her. But we, just knowing the basic background of Mother Cabrini, know that she was motivated by the Holy Spirit and by her vocation, and we can see that in all of her actions in the movie. So that's actually why I think these books are so important, to fill in those gaps for those who might not be aware, to say, this is why she was able to get up at 5 a.m. every morning and power through a day after her orphanage was set on fire, because she was doing this for God and for her neighbor. And I do think it was fair in its portrayal of the church, especially coming from a studio that isn't Catholic. So the respect that she has for the Pope was pretty accurate. I mean, could have maybe been a bit more accurate, but she is shown praying a few times, and the cinematography for the portion in Rome is also quite beautiful, and I think glorifies the church in that way. So I didn't have an issue with it as much as other people did, but
I didn't
I
either.
understand where they're coming from.
I didn't either. I was actually surprised that some of that critique came out. I mean, initially I was like, why? I mean, why? Like, let's just take a second and acknowledge that Angel Studios put together this movie about this Catholic saint. Can that can't just be a win? We can't just let that be a win on its own, you know? It's like, why do we need to nitpick all of this? And then to the point that the critique that's being made about maybe wondering what her inspiration is, I just don't buy it. She's wearing a habit. Clearly they're her nuns. I mean, clearly they're like, there's no question at all in the movie that she's doing this for the Lord. I mean, there's zero question in it that she's doing it for God. So yeah, maybe we don't see her waking up every morning and saying her prayers as diligently as we would have liked. But it is a movie, and the hard part, and what I appreciated about it from just a movie standpoint, is that one of the things that often befalls biopic films is that they try to tell too much of the individual's story. And so they span the whole life of an individual. And then what you end up getting is a very kind of touch and go of moments of that person's life. And so it ends up not really being a good film, because it just kind of feels like we just disjointed all these different elements of somebody's 60-year career with their musician or whatever it is. What I really appreciate about this movie is that it just zeroed in on that one mission in that one time and just getting it off the ground. And it told a very tight narrative that was beautiful. And then when it was over, it just, the epilogue, so to speak, of the film was just kind of conveying what came next after this New York mission was established. But just to tell a simple story about her adversity, her overcoming all these obstacles that never seemed to end. And every time she got her foot, it just seemed like something new emerged, and she never stopped moving forward and never gave up, which was just really, really incredible. And in the book, The World is Too Small, Theodore is quoting here. He says, this is, I guess, when they first came to New York, I think is what it is. And it says, "My daughters, we are missionaries, and missionaries must be prepared for mishaps of this sort. It is a sign that God is going to bless us." This is from page 10. And so just again, that attitude for me was inspirational. I mean, just watching the movie, I was like, oh, this is phenomenal. And then reading the books and kind of prepping for the interview today, because we all have that. I mean, we all have those moments where we feel frustrated or that we're pursuing something that we think God has called us to do. And somewhere along the way, I don't know where it is, but we feel that like, well, because God's called me to do this, it should just bloom, you know? And I see other people whose missions or ideas are blooming. How come mine aren't blooming as much as these? And so we can fall into comparison, certainly. But if there's a place where we can just be patient and be focused and then be diligent, then we can continue to push and pursue those dreams, those desires, those things that we think that God has put on our hearts to bring about betterment of his kingdom here on earth. And that's a fine line, you know, in terms of knowing when to give up versus when to keep pushing. But what we see with her is she just continues to keep pushing, and is relentless in it, you know, in the movie. So I offered a couple different thoughts there, but just I just want to wrap this up again. I didn't really buy that critique. I guess I get it. I sympathize with, sure, you want to have a little bit more prayer. Fine. Okay. But like, let's just acknowledge like what happened here, and that this is a really beautiful movie that was made. But then going back to this notion of kind of missionaries, you know, you have to kind of, if we're going to be doing missionary work, and we're going to be called to serve, then hiccups are part of the process. And, and it's funny. So I was drawn to her story for a lot of reasons. I guess one, we lived in New Orleans for 10 years. I'm from Nicaragua. We immigrated to the United States when I was little. So being an immigrant, being from Nicaragua, knowing she was in Nicaragua, I was fascinated by that aspect of the story, fascinated by her time in New York, in New Orleans. I lived in Chicago for a few years, so fascinated by her time in Chicago. I mean, it's just like, come on, mother, what are you doing? I'm not Italian, but like everybody thinks I am because my last name's Sacasa, you know? Right. But in New Orleans specifically, New Orleans specifically, like when the sisters first come to New Orleans, they get into their room and they see the mosquito nets hanging over the bed. And they think that it's too luxurious for them because they're supposed to be, you know, poor sisters. And so they take the nets off and then they go to sleep. And then they wake up the next morning kind of covered in mosquito bites and then realize it wasn't a luxury. It's okay. We can allow ourselves to have mosquito nets. But she commands her sisters to go, and she says, I can only pay for you to get halfway from New York to New Orleans. And then when they get halfway, then you're going to have to beg the rest of the way to get to New Orleans. So they beg the rest of the way to get to New Orleans. Imagine that in like a sign up for this religious community. This is what, you know, like in today's day and age, you know what I mean? So you're a young woman who's discerning religious life. Like, here we go. Here's what we got for you. All your needs will be taken care of. So they finally get to New Orleans, and she says, all right, once you've established the mission in New Orleans, I'll come. Let me know when you have some progress. When they finally secured $17.03 is when they decided that it was a success. And so now we can call Mother to come and to help us get the rest of the way.
Yep, we are not in debt anymore. Praise God.
Yeah, exactly. We're not begging anymore. We just got $17. You know, we got some foundation. But it seemed like that was kind of her process, which was almost like this serial entrepreneur for the Lord. Like, we go get this thing, whatever the needs are in this community, I'm going to come in, I'm going to use very gifted in terms of organizational skills. There's no doubt about that. Very pragmatic, very bold in being willing to ask for help when needed, bold in her vision. But I reiterate that it seems like there's just this real pragmatism, her ability to kind of be able to know the local government and politics and what people need, being able to know what kind of levers to pull to get something to happen. But as soon as she kind of gets it up and running, she entrusts it to her sisters, and then she's out to another mission.
Yes.
And it just seemed like that was kind of what was on repeat for everything that she established after New York. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, so many good points. I think one thing I would bring attention to is, as you mentioned, coupled with her pragmatism, how did she know when to stop versus when to persevere? And I think one interesting case in the movie is that at the end, there's a part where she seems like she's giving up. And it's because she has been told by the Archbishop, under obedience, so he is invoking the obedience due to her vocation, that she has to leave. And of course, we see that gets resolved. Spoiler alert.
Right.
But, that was really the parameters of the church and of her vocation were the only things that she considered to be real barriers. And of course, the only thing she considered to be a real enemy was sin. And she saw all worldly barriers as things that could be easily overcome through perseverance and through the gifts, the special charisms, really, that she had to work through these problems. So I thought that was very interesting, because we ask that question often of what is possible. And as long as it is morally good and not violating any of the tenets of the church and not causing one to sin, then go for it. And that was the attitude that she had. And oftentimes she was successful. And then when she wasn't, she would take that as God's will and just believe this rejection is redirection idea and know that she was needed somewhere else.
Wow. It's incredible. Incredible. Mother Cabrini, pray for us. Well, Kristen, as we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation, I mean, I just want to know a little bit more about her passing. I mean, you said kind of briefly at the beginning that she was in Chicago. She was making packages for sick kids. What was she doing? Just what were the context of her passing? Yeah.
Yes. As far as I understand, this was something that, of course, was a result of her weakened health and weakened heart from her early tuberculosis, but that actually was specifically a complication of malaria. So this must have been something that she contracted on one of her journeys.
I was going to say malaria in Chicago. I mean, she was like
exactly.
in North Africa and Latin America, like
within her body, and maybe she was fighting this off for years too. And so,
got it.
It seems from what I read that no one really could tell that she was all that sick because she was working. So we really won't know exactly how bad it was throughout her entire life. And the movie does show some of this where she kind of braces herself for the day and when she's dressing, and then 10 seconds later she's with her sisters and with the orphans with a smiling face, and you would never know that anything was wrong, except for in a few cases where she's overcome by her health. But this seems to be the case up until the end, and she was doing a bit lighter work, of course, at that point, not digging a well like we see
in the movie,
New York, but still, of course, probably very much in charge and giving direction up until that moment.
And then the movie talks about at her funeral it being broadcasted on radio, and I forgot what number of individuals would kind of listen to it as it was happening. Any other details that you picked up along the way you kind of know about with regards to her funeral and kind of how people responded to her passing?
I don't know too much about the details of her funeral, but I know her canonization mass was also just huge numbers, both in the Vatican itself and then also at various prayer rallies and groups in the United States. And
you said that when you were kind of doing this process, this project of writing, you talked to your grandparents and they had indicated that they were had devotions to Mother Cabrini. And where
That's
from?
Right.
Where are they from?
So they would have been German and Irish immigrant families. So
to where? To New York?
Not Italian,
Boston, or?
but they are from New York.
Yeah.
And they lived in upstate. So probably their parents would have been contemporaries of Mother Cabrini's or the previous generation. So I imagine that they either attended one of her missions at one point or came across her sisters in person or were just very aware of her work. And of course, coming from a line of immigrants too, would have sympathized with that part of her story.
Wow. Well, any final anecdotes or stories or anything that struck you about her story that we haven't covered yet?
Let's see. Well, I think if you don't mind, I'll close with a prayer that Mother Cabrini wrote herself.
Yeah, that'd be phenomenal. Yeah,
if you're
thank
for that.
you.
All
yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Love us, Jesus, with your sweet chains. Of that pure love we fain would claim. Our wings to heaven we open wide, to leave low earth and there abide. Amen.
Amen.
As you can see, she was quite poetic as well as her other talents.
Yeah, you mentioned that her ability to write about just seeing the sea and her reflections on these many transatlantic voyages, which I think came up to be like 24 or something that she did in her.
It's got to be, yeah, something like that.
Incredible. And it's not like they had iPhones or movies to like pass the time either. You know, like you spend a week out at sea and you don't have any sort of anti-nausea medicine either to help you kind of get through
work.
it. Like,
Yeah,
it's just what it is. So, but thank you for that final prayer. Really appreciate it. And Kristen, thank you so much for just taking time again to join me and my audience here on the podcast. And if people are interested in acquiring either of the books, The World is Too Small, or Mother Cabrini Companion, what's the best way to kind of get a hold of them?
Sure. So the best way is directly at sophiainstitute.com. And I believe you can bundle these books. We also have a children's book about Mother Cabrini, a picture book. So one or all three are available right at our website.
Sounds great. And if people are more interested in the work that you're doing and other writing projects that you have, how can they access those?
Yes. So let's see, my main writing projects will be announced probably on my Substack, which has not been updated for a while, but it's called On the Wheel, after my favorite saint, Catherine of Alexandria. So you can look at my work there, and then of course also keep an eye on Sophia Institute and other interviews that I might be doing there. Sounds great. Well, we'll have links to those in the show notes. Well, Kristen Theriault, not Van Uden. Well, still Van Uden, but you're still a Van Uden, just Theriault now. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been an absolute delight having you back on the podcast. Oh, my pleasure. Thank you again for having me. All right, everybody. Well, many blessings to you. Thanks so much for hanging in there all the way to the end. I'm so grateful for Kristen and for her time coming back on the show. Just a delight, a pleasure to have a conversation with her. Just like last time, it's just easy to talk to. So I'm super grateful for her time and her availability. I know that she's in the midst of this press junket for this book. And so I know that she's been doing a lot of these types of interviews, and so grateful for the extended time she gave to me. So if you're interested in those books, we'll have links to them in the show notes. And lastly, we just want to say that we pay attention and we learn about the saints, not just to, oogle or awe in what the Lord can do, for sure. But we just are reminded that these are people like us, and that they have certain callings for sure. But you know what? So do we. And they've just taken it and have been able to live these lives of heroic virtue that are incredible witnesses to us about what we are capable of doing as human beings, and that we have incredible potential as people to be able to bring people closer to the Lord, that the work that we can do to be able to serve others and to minister to them and genuinely help them in their physical needs and their emotional needs, as well as in their spiritual needs. And that the lives of the saints are always there to encourage us, and that we're not meant to look at them and to feel less than them or to put them up on this exalted pedestal, but rather to be inspired by them and to be able to take whatever we can from their story and apply it to our own. And something about Mother Cabrini's story, as I've entered into this reflection, both for this podcast and then after watching the movie, her story has really inspired me. And I said this on the show, and I'm going to say it again. And I think what inspired me is just this notion that she wasn't this, she didn't have all these mystical experiences. I know she had some in that, but her prayer life was certainly anchored in her faith and in her, and just being dutiful. And that was enough. That was enough for her to be able to do it and to just keep moving forward and to not be deterred by the obstacles that presented themselves. And so I am asking for Mother Cabrini to continue to pray for me in the ventures that the Lord has put on my heart, and that I may be as faithful as she has been. And so my encouragement is to all of you to do similarly. And let's allow and invite this great saint to partner with us on our journey as we continue to do the work that God's called us to do to build up his kingdom here on earth. So God bless you all. Thank you so much. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and be good, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.